Again, ma'am, what is your name?
Joan Simond, originally Joan Campen.
And please spell those last names.
I'm sorry.
Please spell the names.
Campon, and the married name is Simond, Symond.
Beautiful. And tell me a little about your life. Where were you born?
I was born actually in the Bronx, uh, in New York City, the borough of the Bronx, but we lived in Manhattan. And my father had his work downtown, and we lived in a very residential atmosphere, uptown.
And you were what is the date of your birth?
January 17th, 1930.
Tell me a little bit about your mom and your dad's life.
My mother was very much a mother. And I had two siblings. They were older than I by 14 and 16 years. And she always picked a wonderful apartment for us that had lots of lights and fresh air. And for the kids, it was near parks, and uptown Manhattan was very lovely, very residential at that time. And so we had life uptown. There was a typical neighborhood with everything you would need to have a life. There were schools, firehouse. I could go on and on and on. And my father would go down for his work. He was a commercial photo engraver, but he was also a master of vocal arts. And he taught many remarkable people. Many times the opera singers who had just knocked their voices out of kilter with the rehearsals and then again with the performances, they would have to come to him to have their voice restored, to have their vocal mechanism restored. So he had quite a life.
And how did your family come to Binghamton?
How did I come?
How did your family come to Binghamton?
My family.
Yeah.
Well, they came, as so many did, from Europe. My mother and her family had to have been here. I'm the sixth generation on my mother's side, born here. And my father and his family, my grandfather, my dad's father, had been part of Garibaldi's army of reunification in Italy. And he especially wanted to get away from the town that they lived in because they had lost a son. And he was just a baby, and he was grieving heavily for that. And so he was part of the Army of Reunification, but he also did some traveling, and he had come to America on his own.
Mm.
And after he had been gone many years, he came back to his family and started the second half of the family. And they came to America finally to stay at I think it was about 1899 to 1900, because I remember my father saying that he had crossed the equator twice. They celebrated New Year's Eve twice that year. And one of the reasons, there's a longer story about what had happened to bring them, but my uncle, Peter T. Campen, who later became a councilman here in Binghamton and spoke on Americanism and Columbus throughout and originally he worked for Kilmer selling the swamp root as a young man. And
So what brought your father to Binghamton?
my father to Binghamton, he was part of the family that came here in 1900. He's the one who told me about celebrating New Year's Eve twice.
Oh boy.
Yes.
And he was ill and came to Binghamton for treatment?
No, not at that time. That, I'm
Okay.
talking about later on in 1959.
Okay.
We came up here because of his illness
So he originally came to Binghamton
as a child.
as a child, and his parents came here for what reason? For work or?
For to go to the new country, to start a new life,
Okay.
as everyone did. And they had a son here also, who was part of the first family that had been birthed in Italy, and he is Peter T. Campen, as I told you.
Right.
And
How did he pick Binghamton the first time? How did he pick
you
Binghamton the
got
first
me.
time?
I wouldn't be able to tell you. I have no idea.
So in
Probably because of
1959
his work,
Okay.
which is why people came to work for EJ.
Yes.
And which way EJ? That they knew that they could have a family, get married, which they couldn't do in Europe. And people who came, this is what I've found so riveting when I watched the Endicott Johnson documentary on PBS. These people had no work. They had no life. If it hadn't been for Mr. Johnson, they would not have had a life. They wouldn't have had their families, their homes, their children, their work, their community life. To me, that is amazing that this man, this one man, and the other people who worked with him and were partners with him, they did all that.
Tell me about your job in Manhattan with IBM. How did you come to work for IBM?
Well, it's hard to say. I knew it was a good company, but I wasn't like people from Binghamton. I thought it was just another company. And when I was transferred up here, to digress a minute, when I was transferred up here, I met some people here, and I decided to quit a year later because it was so different from my New York City life.
Headquarters versus research and manufacturing.
Yes, exactly. And when I first discovered that I didn't belong at IBM Owego, it wasn't for me. But this one girl said, "Oh, Joan, I give you a lot of credit to leave IBM." And I thought to myself, what are you talking about? But see, I didn't know the history.
Right.
And why people had of necessity come up to this area. And how they had been blessed.
What do you know of the Watson family? You said Watson Sr. would walk down the hall and...
In Manhattan, yes. He was very much older at that time. And he would walk down, he's very self-possessed, but very nice. And his son, while I worked there, was part of the president, I believe, of IBM, and he had offices in the world headquarters, where I worked. And it was a very nice place to work. They were up against a lot of competition, and I was there during the IBM versus DJ versus IBM case, Department of Justice versus IBM, as a monopoly being brought to task. My friend wants to go somewhere. So.
Okay. Well, let's wrap this up then. So tell me a little bit about your life in Binghamton. How did you meet your husband?
He worked at IBM, just as I did.
So you met him in the first year of being in Binghamton,
Yes,
in 1959.
pretty much. Yes, that's right.
And how
We were
soon after
married in
meeting?
61.
Okay. And you lived on the west side?
Yes.
Primarily? What do you love about Binghamton?
That is still in its own way, it's old school. It has a great history behind it. And I love the promise that we will return to the values that made this city and made this nation great. We've lost a lot of what we had gained through sweat equity, hard-working people who knew what it was to work and had a very wonderful work ethic. We need that again. We need to remember that God loves us and He's on our side. And He wants us to go back to that which was the real, the true. And keep away from the false, which we're surrounded by the false. And we must succeed in this.
Well, thank you, Joan, or Mrs. Simon Campon.
Yes.
Campon
right.
Simon.
Yes.
Well, thank you, Miss Joan Simon Campon. I'm sorry. Thank you, Miss Joan Campon Simon,
Joan Simon,
for your time. You're a beautiful spirit, and at age 92, in beautiful health, and so interesting to talk to. Thanks for sharing your story.
Of you. I appreciate your interest in what I had to say. That's a gift in itself that you have given me.